One second. Yeah. Okay. Hello, everybody. I want to start. This event is after a long day of talks in the framework of this project that's called Perverse Decolonization, which is a long-term project initiated by the Academy of Arts of the World in Köln, together with a network of 6 institutes that throughout the world, and the center is one of them. And David will soon tell you much more about the project as such. We'll have 2 talks. The first is by David Riff, and then by Hans de Christ. David is a writer, translator, artist, and curator. From 2003 to 2008, he was a member of Stodelat. He has written widely on contemporary art in Russia. Recent curatorial projects include the bi-yearly Pluriversal 1 to 7 at Köln. Monday begins on Saturday at Bergen Assembly in 2013. The first Ural Industrial Biennial in Yekaterinburg. Sorry for that. It's hard. It was much harder than I cut through like halfway. Currently, Riff is is curator of discourse at the art festival in Graz, Austria.
Okay, thank you, Udi, for the introduction, and thank you for having us here and being part of our project, Perverse Decolonization, which I'll try to tell you a little bit about, and maybe also try to give a little bit of background of what inspired it, and also to give a general frame of what we're talking about and what we've done so far. Maybe the announcement was a bit misleading. I won't be talking so much about my own curatorial practice and the projects that Udi just mentioned or others, but rather try to focus on this particular topic. And then I think Hans will give you a broader overview of the kind of things that his institution is doing. So there you'll have more of pictures of actual curatorial projects and things like this. My talk will be more of an introduction into the project in general. So this project that we're doing has an unusual name. It sounds sort of almost nightmarish, Perverse Decolonization, and it's not quite clear what it could mean. Maybe I try to explain. As Udi already said, it's an international research and discussion project that addresses the current crisis in post-colonial studies and identity politics, and its possible appropriations in new nationalisms emerging on a global scale. And it proposes to look closely at how the decolonizing agenda we generally support is enlisted in reactionary projects, and what new forms of solidarity and common action we might propose to resist these dangers. Our point of departure in all of this was the ubiquitous diagnosis of the rise of new nationalisms, both major and minor, majoritarian identitarian movements on the one hand, and minoritarian resistant discourses on the other hand, both embroiled in part in identity politics. The utopia of the globe, which used to dominate thinking in the 90s and the 2000s as a kind of globalism, gives way to the utopia of the nation, to paraphrase Bruno Latour. Isolationist tendencies, particularisms, identitarian populisms perform something like a discursive cleansing. That is, they revise history. They create replicas to make that history plausible. They play at reenacting history in a completely new way, and they completely cleanse the discourse of anything else other than what confirms an identity. And they triumph at lightning speed very quickly in all over the world, really, in semi-peripheries like Turkey or Russia, in Southeast and East Asia, and in the former centers of the so-called former colonial world, in Britain, France, Netherlands, United States, Germany too. To resist these new nationalisms that are really arising all over the place, to the point that you could really talk about a kind of, yeah, the old dream of the Nazis was to create a anti-Comintern, you know, like an international of fascist movements. And we seem to be stepping closer and closer actually to this old dream. So the urgency to resist is really also everywhere, and you can really find it as an absolute urgency, but it raises very difficult questions for those cultural producers and theorists who since decades have been invested in a post-colonial critique in the frame of a liberal system that is currently in crisis. And this is, so here while I was giving the presentation upstairs, I was talking a lot about our institution in Cologne and how we sort of fell into a situation where and I didn't explain it very well. My basic point, and I won't bore you with the details of the institution I was working in, other than to say that it was an intercultural, decolonizing institution aimed against the general, I would say, yeah, Western art hegemony in a very multicultural city that is Cologne. So that in one sentence I just summarized a whole 30 minutes of blah blah. You know, and we had this job and we're working and trying to really fight hard to fulfill this agenda, and became skeptical for two reasons. One would be the role actually that post-colonial discourse plays in West Germany, in the West, yeah, in the former West. So in Germany, but also in other European countries, and how that role sort of diffuses out to the rest of the world. So in Europe, I would say that at the moment we're experiencing a hegemony actually in the art world of post-colonial discourse, but it's a kind of neutralized or depoliticized version of what that discourse could be. It's one that shows you, that gives you a very wide spread of the whole world, that presents very many different identities in a kind of panoply where there's always a very clear speaker position. So if you're an Israeli artist, you have very clear things to say about Israel, very clear set of kind of, yeah, a mission, so to speak, or a job to do in this Western art system. Same thing if you're Russian speaking or if you have some knowledge of Russia. So for an example, I lived in Russia for 13 years. I'm not of Russian origin, but I routinely am identified as a Russian and asked to speak in a very certain way about Russia. And if I somehow go, you know, and diverge from that path, then I'm no longer really desirable. So actually, we're talking about a very clearly regulated set of representations that you could accuse, and as we did in our, somehow even on a programmatic level through our institution, to say, well, yes, this is a form of multiculturalism that's first of all culinary. It's a kind of gastronomic principle, and second of all, it's actually Orientalist, because you're creating a kind of idealized version of struggles, of originary situations in former colonies, of a kind of understanding attitude also on the part of a educated liberal public in the center that would be, you know, then willing to sort of display sympathy, but only to a degree. And so we asked ourselves all the time, why do we have this feeling that we're really playing in this kind of, yeah, in a kind of representative theater, and in something that is more and more becoming a hegemonic system, and something that maybe is also creating an alibi for new colonialisms, and maybe is even also in some ways in a kind of, if you think of a kind of NGO language of art that's been developing over the last years, that's been being used also to spread, let's say, a neoliberal hegemony all over the globe. So that in countries that are profoundly neo-colonial, you would have art institutions that are actually representing the same thing to show, yes, we're being very critical, and this is our criticality. Many years ago, theorist Udi Edelman used this term embedded criticality, and I think that certainly applies to post-colonial discourse, not as it's practiced in former colonies. I would say here we have a different evolution, and we need to look at it quite closely and see, you know, where there are bifurcations, divergences, where the politics of it lead. But in the West, where generally it's rather about a politics of representation and display, but as I said, a much needed one. So I have to sort of, sorry, I have to find my place in a written text. So that was the first thing that we found disconcerting. The second thing is that we often encountered in our self-proposed mission to decolonize knowledge about art in the cultural scene of multicultural Cologne, we found ourselves often encountering positions that were, let's say, availing themselves of what Gayatri Spivak calls a strategic essentialism. Positions that were claiming that the essence of a decolonial struggle would be to claim an identity and to really to live that identity, to allow that identity, to give that identity the possibility for self-determination and possibly to lead on a road to nationhood or to a reclaiming of the idea of a national belonging. And of course, you know, when we encountered these versions of identity politics, also where there's a sort of what Vivek Chibber, sociologist from New York, has called the Olympics of victimhood. Yes, this kind of so we can compete. Who is the bigger victim? Because there are victims throughout history, we know, and everyone was at some point a victim, and now you claim this. Even if you're in a majoritarian, if you belong to the silent majority, yeah, you're white in Germany, you're a German, but suddenly you present yourself also as the victim. So this of course. It makes us very skeptical because as people coming from, so I only lived there, I don't come from there, my colleague Yekaterina Djolgit, who we invented this project together with, comes from the former Soviet Union. And you know, I lived there for 13 years and we could witness firsthand a kind of identity politics arising in Russia. Also a new form of, yeah, I would say, a counter-imperialism with its own imperial agenda, that is the expansionist program of Putinism at the moment. And we also, so Katya as a post-Soviet Jew, I as a diasporic Jew, but living in the former Soviet Union, also made the experience, of course, of a Jewish identity politics rising in the former Soviet Union and where it led. So going from a resistant discourse, one that was very much against the Soviet status quo and actually claiming all kinds of emancipative strands from other intellectual traditions, not only the Jewish one, narrowing itself down really to becoming a religious Zionist project at this point. So you could see actually, and these are evolutions that we witnessed among our closest friends. So when we see the version of identity politics as it's practiced in many ways among other groups, we become you know, skeptical for those, let's say, two major reasons that I now sketched so quickly. So all of this informed our work and interests as we tried to sort of find our way through post-colonial theory, which still to us appears as the best way to insist in many ways on the distinctive singularity of identities threatened by globalizing normalization, to evince their resistance to structural adjustment and cultural flattening, and to proclaim their right to self-determination, or at least to self-understanding, and to live that. Today, that emancipative agenda is more urgent than ever as people flee turmoil from all over the world and find themselves facing a resurgence of xenophobia and colonial relations, and also an inner colonialism. And I should say that in Germany, this is probably something that most of you maybe don't understand fully, that you know, this picture, positive picture of Merkel welcoming big migrant influx, and you know, Germans kind of saying we can do it, and you know, we can, you know, open our hearts and our minds, obscures a far more, I would say, nefarious picture of the arising of a new inner colonial class that is also spatially, ideologically, in every which way separated from the majority of society and locked into either chronic unemployment, if you're waiting for your asylum to come through, or locked into the service industry unless you fit the profile of the few experts that make it past that point. So this is really also one of the things that I should say here. So we need this post-colonial theory, but at the same time, there's a problem. The particularization of struggles has made it almost impossible to confront the unified nationalist we that now arises with such a frightening force. You can search for intersections between struggles, but it's very difficult actually to build coalitions where everyone is insisting upon their singularity and where there's a certain routine denial of universalism and universality as a colonial tool. And that is actually, you know, in a sort of banal version of post-colonial studies and post-colonial discourse, is what happens on a routine basis during discussions. So when you start to reference any kind of universalism, you're kind of told that you're resorting to something that is very, very problematic. And that would happen with even quoting philosophers. I don't know, you try quoting Hegel in some context and you will be shouted down for similar reasons. So, I mean, this is, this to me is something very problematical. Sorry. So also, of course, post-colonial studies emerged in a way and shares with identity politics this profound anti-universalist bias for political reasons. You know, post-colonial studies emerged right at the end, in its current form, at the end of the Cold War, and occluded out of a Marxist critique of colonialism all of those themes that became less and less convenient. And that economic critique of colonialism became less and less important. Actually, what happened is that there was this major culturalization of post-colonial studies, and that is what we're now dealing with. And that leads straight into identity politics, because if you were formulating a struggle around, you know, and you leave away all the economic side of it, and you focus only on power relations and only on the domination of one identity over another, the unrecognized identity and the ultra-recognized identity, you really have a problem, because it leads straight into that fetishism of your own experience of who you are and who you can be. So there's this blindness to issues of social justice that extending beyond identitarian boundaries that becomes extremely problematical, especially when you're talking about forging broader coalitions against the larger sort of evil that we're dealing with. Sorry about the evil, but still. That blindness is of course very convenient when it comes ex cathedra, from a position of dominance, from a cultural institution whose function ultimately becomes to red, green, pink, brown wash a profoundly neo-colonial global situation where all of the things that, it's an alibi, a pressure valve. From the position of the post-colonial world, by the way, that could actually seem strange. So in our project, we also invited people from South Asia, Southeast Asia, a colleague from the Philippines, Renan Laruan. After our meetings in Cologne in October, was it? October or November? I forget already. It was I think it was October. In October, in Cologne, he said, you know, it's all very interesting. You're talking about on the last day of our meeting. He said, we've been talking about post-colonial studies for 2 days now, and it's so strange to me. Why is it so fashionable in Europe? Because in the Philippines, we stopped talking about this in the 90s already. And like for the entire 2000s, everyone in the Philippines, except for me, who's he's still interested in post-colonial studies, is a neo-Marxist, and you know, sort of. So there's, it is strange, and it seems like some kind of speaking for an entire part of the world, maybe also. What seems equally dangerous in an age of cultural appropriations, fusions, and cultural crossovers, so that would be already a cultural appropriation actually, is having defined speaker positions, you know, giving you the version of post-colonial situation that would seem to sort of confirm the status quo, and you know, at least make it livable, let's say like that. There are many other forms of a cultural appropriation can take. So, for an example, that the new nationalism takes sensibilities and self-understandings from what used to be the left, and that includes availing itself of strategies developed in the frame of a left liberal post-colonial critique. The new right not only benefits from the left's ongoing fragmentation in that way, it actually directly steals discursive weapons, including the rhetorical repertoire of identity politics and post-colonial theory. So you could sometimes recognize the uncanny return of rhetorical elements from the context of decolonization, where, for an example, the diversification of universalism of Baltamignolo, or the strategic essentialism, I already mentioned it, of the subaltern of Gayatri Spivak, become argumentative strategies to overcome, where they play the role, of course, as argumentative strategies to overcome the remnants of the colonial system, and now they become arguments of new nationalist agendas insisting upon the right to essentialize their ways into a parallel dimension. So we know that it's not really true, but we believe this, we choose to believe this. We're modern people, but we know that actually this, this is the truth. And it's our strategic choice to believe in this essentialism. I think it's very dangerous when you hear this kind of talk, because either you're an essentialist or you're not. Either you're a particularist or you're not. Either you believe in universalism or you don't. And you can't actually have your cake, so to speak, and eat it too. If you're critical of essentialism, of a Western essentialism, you should be critical of your own non-Western essentialism, actually. This is at least our perhaps somewhat repressive post-Soviet internationalist view of the matter. So, also may be problematical. But the worrying takeover of identity politics to some degree by the alt-right and neo-nationalist movements. This is not just some myth, like there are actually movements that are doing this. There's, for an example, in Germany, really this movement called the identitarian movement that presents an image of white victimhood and a need to reclaim a European identity that supposedly is being eroded by the big takeover, as they call it. They have this or the big replacement of Muslims coming into Europe, which is ridiculous, of course, if you think about the percentages involved and also of the cultural shifts involved. There's no such thing happening in Europe at the moment, but this kind of strange fusion language allows people to present themselves and to use, I would say, a language of victimhood and a language of resistance for exactly the opposite, perverted purposes. So this is where the word perversion, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not talking about perversion in its kind of classical Freudian sexual way, but rather in perversion as in something gone completely wrong and twisted into its own opposite. Yeah, of kind of inverted of using a weapon of resistance as a tool for dominance. This shouldn't prompt feelings of helplessness or ubiquitous corruption, and it just shows that now is the time to engage in a broader reconsideration of the contradictions of the emancipation from colonial domination, where the emergence of new imperialisms was and is always an option. Faced with the resurgence of nationalism, we have to ask how the decolonization of knowledge production turns into its own opposite and what we can do to stop that. So our goal is to spark a discussion on decolonizing and post-colonial thinking today, both within a kind of theoretical context, but also practically. We've invited artists, theorists, curators, and so it's quite a diverse group from different places also. So as Udi said, 6 different institutions, of course one here, 2 in Germany, there's 1 in Poland, 1 in Hong Kong, and 1 in Chicago. So this is quite, we're spreading it broadly and trying to see what different versions of this problematic we can find in these different places, and as we have meetings very much like this one in all of them. and maybe now I can tell you about some of the diagnostic points and some of the ideas that we were following, that we had as a proposal of where the research would go, and then maybe I'll tell you a little bit about where it has actually been going. So we proposed this notion of a perverse decolonization that is actually something that persists. You could describe maybe and find a very good description of the whole logic in Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, which describes incredibly how the violence of colonialism is then mirrored back in anti-colonial violence, and what institutional forms, and I think that's very important. I mean, it's, the beginning of his book is a kind of sympathetic account of anti-colonial violence, but then it becomes more differentiated, and he starts to talk about how that mirrored violence is then reinstitutionalized and actually becomes a factor in the emergence of a new nation state, for an example. You know, completely eliminates the perspective for a real emancipative project. What happens in that situation often is that the political dimension is actually denied to post-colonial subjects. That happens on the one hand within struggles themselves, but then also, of course, from the view from the outside, from the metropolis. So that there's actually, you have the right to culture. You can have your culture, but what you can't have is a say in politics. You can celebrate your culture all you like, but you can, and conflicts, those conflicts actually will be essentialized as conflicts of race, ethnicity, or religion. And the past, the real past, is perverted and rewritten. And this is you know, you can look at the Middle East actually and its history as a particularly tragic example, where the strong communist and socialist connections all across the region are being denied and erased by the mainstream, at least. You know, and you would have a memory of it in some small sections of society, but are really being erased from both left and right. One should say, to be fair, in favor of a totally different narrative based on ethnicity, race, racism, on pure victimhood of refugees or pure evil of terrorists. And I think this is a very dangerous thing that flattens complex post-colonial histories and hybrid post-internationalist identities, which become very important to reclaim in an increasingly polarized world that's playing out the hackneyed but no less tragic drama of this clash of civilizations, for an example. So this is a classical example of how a political dimension completely vanishes and is desublimated into race, religion, ethnicity, experience. And I think that's even worse in some ways, when experience becomes the basis of everything. You have to be able to say things about something you didn't experience and that isn't in your blood, so to speak. It's very important. To look more closely at these complexities through artworks and narratives from intellectual histories is one of the project's goals. What seems crucial in that story, actually, when I was talking about Frantz Fanon and The Wretched of the Earth, one of the big questions within the post-colony is actually this moment when so-called silent majority of the population, or populist uprising against local cosmopolitan self-colonized elites. Yes? And this is a narrative that actually travels from the post-colonial world right back to the metropolis. So you could actually discover, very interestingly, this same kind of uprising against the self-colonizing elite in a country, an unexpected context as Poland, where there is at the moment a very strong anti-colonial, post-colonial discourse arising that's really taking many arguments and strategies and narratives from the post-colonial studies, but that's doing that to assert a Polish nationhood. Poland, they say, and Poland is now, this is the position of actually from intellectuals who are close to the ruling party of Poland, which, as you maybe know, is Christian, ultra right-wing, some even say fascist party. So fascist, it's a word I would use more historically. Here I would really say they're authoritarian, ultra-right-wing, maybe proto-fascist, but they're not quite there yet. So still. And the idea is that, so Poland was colonized first by always either Germany or Russia. It was always either the West or the East. And Poles have to decide what's more dangerous, so probably actually the ruling party now would tell you, like, we're not as afraid of the Russians because the Russians won't destroy us completely. They will just, take us over and make us part of their evil empire, whereas the West, they will destroy us from the inside and they will destroy our Polish identity. And this is actually the accusation against the previous government of Donald Tusk, who was, as you know, neoliberal, kind of Europeanist, and saying this is actually the Polish intelligentsia is acting as a proxy and colonizing us now in the name of the West. So we must have an uprising against this. What happens is a very strange thing. You have an anti-communist government that starts reclaiming social policies also of the communist times in the name of anti-Western identity politics, like the Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the people, like the Nazis had. This deserves to be fed. If you're a Pole, you have a right to a dignified life. And actually, the reason to kick out all the foreigners, of which there are very few, I assure you, in Poland, one of the most Islamophobic, or maybe the most Islamophobic country in Europe, and with the smallest number of Muslims. So it's a phantom Islamophobia. And it's also paralleled by a phantom anti-Semitism. There are no Jews left in Poland, not really. Some converted, some moving back, but not really. But yet anti-Semitism is actually a huge argument, and if you really want to insult someone, you call them a Jew. Like this is in Poland still the case, in intellectual discourse even. And at the same time, a support for Israel. So it's a very perverse situation. I would say, this kind of idea, we must decolonize ourselves from everyone, and this is what you get, like a kind of a strange victimist discussion that's very much talking about and we had 2 days of intense debates about the different details of this in Warsaw. We invited sociologists, historians, one psychoanalyst also, who was telling us all about how this perversion actually does have a sort of a resemblance, let's say, to a more simple psychoanalytical talk of perversion, also because it and now I forgot his exact argumentation, but because it represses so much, and also because it invents fictitious mirrors into which to project oneself. Okay, so another thing, and finally, I think maybe there are two other, or not one other thing, but two other things that are very disconcerting. That maybe in the Polish case, sort of one doesn't see so much, but elsewhere is very much so the case, especially in Russia, and I already mentioned it before, is this national, the national imperial reinvention can involve the takeover of colonial logic and the development of an alternative colonial project of exporting a non-Western modernity. So post-colonial studies always fetishize non-Western modernity as something that's very great and really an alternative to perhaps even capitalism as we know it. Whereas what we see now is that this is quite dangerous. From that position, you have to support all kinds of people who today are considered really dictators. Yeah. So, for example, Putin. Putin is really has succeeded fantastically well in reviving at least part of the old Soviet diplomacy, of the old Soviet foreign policy. The types that are working in foreign policy are quite different from the other people he has in his government. So, domestic policy, it's nationalists and neoliberals. Here you have the old Soviet elite and people who really resemble this old kind of party aristocracy and who are making arguments that are basically anti-imperialist arguments that are geared let's say, in two directions. On the one hand, toward nationalists elsewhere, and to internationalists elsewhere. And it's a very strange way of sort of binding them together. Yeah? Of saying, yeah, what are we doing in Ukraine? We're fighting fascism. We're fighting the new European fascism. It's spreading. It's coming to us. These Banderovцы in Ukraine, they're going to take over, and they're going to create a new Holocaust. Because, you know, we all know that in Russia this is repeated very nicely. You know, this Travniki camp where the Ukrainian guards were practicing shooting on the inmates, and, you know, like the Ukrainians were the biggest workforce in Auschwitz, and, you know, we have all these documents here. Please, you can see fascism is ingrained in the Ukrainian psyche, and we are the main anti-fascists. And actually, it's interesting that part of the Antifa, for an example, in Germany would support that argument, or the left party. So this is an export of what I would say is an unacknowledged imperialism or colonialism. Soviet colonialism is a topic in and of itself that probably is a can of worms that if we were to talk about, we would have to talk about all kinds of other unacknowledged situations like North Korea and so on. But let's leave it at that. I should say though, that there are many contemporary versions. I mean, Putin is just one. You have expansionist programs now of China, Turkey, Iran, yeah? And many other countries. You can imagine also every European country actually inventing its new imperialism that is maybe a kind of presents itself as now non-Western and is divergent from the old one. So this is if you can imagine these kind of counter projects. One very interesting one that we had in the one of our researchers who's from China and who's researching situation of the colonization of Manchukuo, you know, Japanese controlled Manchuria, which was it was taken over in a puppet state with the last Chinese emperor was installed there by the Japanese, who then used a very strange hybrid visual language drawing upon actually Soviet propaganda of internationalism and Soviet images of internationalism. So to show, for an example, on one image all the different ethnic groups kind of coexisting and living in harmony, you know, Asian, so like Chinese, Mongolian, white people who are also in China, so in Manchuria, Harbin and so on. So you have all the different groups and they're all living in harmony of a kind of non-Western empire. Of course, this was a smokescreen and a propaganda to cover up something very different that was happening, which is it's not just the robbing of Manchuria and its instrumentalization for the Japanese war machine and the kind of transformation of its population into work slaves, but there was also the introduction of a strange public-private partnership. So in order to keep investment into Manchukuo and the powerhouse that it was, the industrial powerhouse that it was supposed to become, the Japanese actually invited foreign companies. They didn't follow they had a kind of state-controlled public-private partnership development program for Manchukuo, which was actually ironically led by the grandfather of Shinzo Abe, who was this horrible, then still young colonial administrator under whom all of these war crimes that happened in Manchukuo took place. So this is just a small aside, but we can see that there are these counter-imperialist, let's say, fantasies that lead to imperialism of their own. Finally, and perhaps most ominously, one should discuss really the problematical, problematic, very urgent in Europe today, which is how former colonizers and white majorities mourn for a lost empire and then affect the pose of colonial victimhood. And actually, so you can see this in all of these identitarian movements. this is the height of perversion when in the colonial logic, when an empire loses its colonies and then suddenly begins to imagine itself as being colonized. And you could see this kind of argumentation even in Hitler's Mein Kampf, yeah? Where he says, Germany lost all its colonies, now we're being colonized by the former colonial subjects, they're coming in and they're taking us over, and they're the agents of international capital and the plutocratic Jewish West that's now taking us over. So this is a terrifying thing to look at how these kind of weird, yeah, and then there's quite a bit of detail in actually how he then uses a language to talk about colonialism, and twisting that. I mean, that really, that as a historical precedent should give anyone pause, especially when they look at these identitarian movements. As a counter program, and here I will now, for my colleague, in order not to take too much more time, I'll just go very quickly. But we really feel strongly, and this is more also to kind of mark our own position as eternally diasporic subjects somehow. We need to find a new value to the notion of statelessness as a counter model to the fiercely territorial and very widespread theory of Carl Schmitt, of the territorial theory of the partisan, and the land and sort of taking over the land, the statelessness and sort of embracing one's own statelessness and finding a way to spatialize that would be very important. Also to explore the dimension of not an elite cosmopolitanism, but a subaltern cosmopolitanism, of how people, once they are thrown into these trajectories, possibly also stripped of their privileges, make experiences that actually allow them to communicate across cultures and to work in different situations. I remember when we were in Cologne, we saw a very interesting example of subaltern cosmopolitanism when we talked to a guy who was selling us a sandwich, and it turned out that he spoke like 6 languages, and he spoke fluent Polish, Russian, Arabic. He even spoke Hebrew actually, and he was from Syria, you know. So and complete, you know, there was a kind of understanding like, yeah, I'm here, I'm there, I know this situation, I'm very interested in language, and I'm very interested in other people's cultures, and I sort of want to see that. I always invest a lot of hope in that. Maybe it's wrong, maybe it doesn't exist, other than in these isolated little experiences, which, as I said, we shouldn't trust. The one thing, though, that we can say did actually exist and did actually happen was this global socialist modernity that isn't just reducible to a counter-imperialism. So there's a global experience of socialism, or a global historical phenomenon. Yeah, it's not just those who didn't experience this were just as much affected by it actually as those who did, and whose many untapped possibilities and unacknowledged pitfalls we're constantly proposing to remember. And that's not just in this project, but in all of our curatorial practice. Katja Djoget and I have worked together many times, also in my own projects I'm doing this. So this is something that we're very attached to and we really want to do. In this project, actually, we'll have at the next meeting in Cologne in the autumn, we want to invite someone from Soviet Central Asia, because of course it's a very interesting battlefield between 3 forces: global and allegedly unnational neoliberal corporations, radical religious and nationalist fundamentalisms, and gradually vanishing internationalism. So there you have this very strong influence actually of Russian language that isn't, and Russian culture, that then also people in these countries are claiming for themselves and saying this belongs to us as just as much as it belongs to you. How dare you say that we're that we're excluded from the kind of larger Soviet identity. This is a very interesting thing where we would always hope to develop something like a dirty universalism, not a universalism that's intent on cleansing humanity and sort of unifying humanity into one unitary body, but a dirty universalism that actually acknowledges differences but across irreconcilable regions or sections of the political landscape. So we hope that those kind of communicabilities actually come out of the project itself, that by talking about perversities of different situations and putting them next to one another, that you sort of manage to find some commonalities and some common project. Actually, it's fascinating. Today we spent the whole day talking about the Temple Mount and the idea, the reclaiming of the Temple Mount, which is a big change in the situation here. And of course, you know, like immediately there are resonances with situations elsewhere where identities are being reconstructed and vehemently sort of pushed forward. For an example, in Russia, where you had on actually the site of another something that was always represented as a model, the Palace of the Soviets. There was a swimming pool then later there, as you maybe know, and now it's the site of the Christ the Savior Church, the main symbolic connection between the Russian state and the Russian church, and where Pussy Riot made their famous interventions. So you have this kind of, you know, fascination with replicas and with rebuilding stuff all over the world, and you can find ways, you know, to talk about actually where this comes from and what is the genealogy. Because you would find actually that Russian Orthodoxy in Russia has a similar, let's say, resistant pedigree in the Soviet times, but then now, of course, became hegemonic and turned into its exact opposite. But there was quite a bit of, you know, liberation in that theology at first. So maybe I end here and leave questions for after my colleague Hans Christ, who is one of the members also of our research group. And I allow Udi to introduce him properly.
Thank you, David. So we'll have the discussion later. Just set everything on. So Hans Christ is currently co-director of Kunstverein Stuttgart. He studied art and literature sciences. In 1996, he founded Hartwar Median Kunstverein, together with Iris Dressler. In 2004, he was co-curator of Media City Seoul. His main focus is on large group exhibitions around the historical, actual, political, global, and discursive dimension of conceptual art, in which he collaborates with several other curators and institutions. Just now, very interesting exhibition, 50 years after 50 years Bauhaus, right? And together with Iris, again, he will curate, he will be the curator of the Triennial Bergen Assembly next year. Thank you.
Well, okay. Well, I'm very pleased to be here. That's my first visit, and for me it was a very teaching day. So I heard a lot, I learned a lot, and it's also in combination of elements of theory from where I have to rethink certain kind of aspects of my own thinking. So this is, thank you for the invitation. And also when you mentioned the Bergen Assembly, maybe one of the best triennial, biennial exhibitions I saw in the last years was 2013, the one from David Riff and Katrin Degot, and I'm every time happy to work also with them together in the project. What I will do now, I have 100 images, and I will go very quick through it, and I will try to highlight along these images certain, and I make now my clock on, wait a second. I will try to highlight less certain curatorial practice, because what for me is very important that in the sense I love institutions, and I love that they exist in the certain context in which we are operating. And when I say this we, it's every time, because Iris Dressler and me, we're working now over 20 years together. It's like I'm 50%, and hopefully I can also express something from her perspective. So I want to speak much more about the institutional practice along different kind of projects. And for this, I think it's important to know, the Württembergische Kunstverein is a non-profit. It's founded 1827. So it's one of these typical old bourgeois institutions. And I came there as director very much from grassroots. We founded our own institution with maybe 7 members, and then we took over an institution which has 3,000 members. These are art lovers, and 50% of them are artists. And along the different descriptions, we have a studio house, etc. But I will come along. So if you take a look, so this is an old train station which will be changed now for 10 billion euro. Here is the Kunstverein. Here's the central square. Here's a state opera. Here's a regional parliament. Here's the Ministry for Finance. And here's the main shopping street. So it says the Kunstverein is with this in the center of what you call the power displays of a city. I think in Germany is the only Kunstverein which has this central position in regard to the topography of a city. It consists from this old part, which is now not longer under our control. We are dealing mainly now with the new part, but with the Bauhaus exhibition we used it again. So this is from the front, the golden deer on the top is from the region. And this is when you turn yourself around on the main square. So this typical entertainment, arts business, this is called French Fries and Diamonds. It was the title of a painting by Dieter Roth. And this is expansion of this toilets, you know, during World Championship of Soccer. So what we have is here the entrance part, which is the transparent part of the building, very completely with glass. And then we have a pure white cube, which is 36 by 36 meters without any column. So the most modernist concept of an institution. Also to make that transparent, we get money from the city and the region. In total, we get from these two sides 740,000 euro. And another 80,000 coming in by the members. So membership is 10%. With this, we have to raise money for the program extra, because it's a big house, we have to pay rent. When you mentioned already this collaborative project, so when we're speaking about this actually I didn't thought so much about post-colonial studies, etc., etc. When we're looking in the history, in 1989 there was something happened. We were all sure in the West with our education that we know what is going on between these two poles, which was in North America and the rest was Middle Europe. And then it was an explosion of a territory where we know nothing. There's an incredible gap. We were confronted with situations, we were curious, and out of this curiosity we invited people through very often a slow developing network. So you see some people you will recognize in other projects like Daniel Garcia Andújar, Dan and Lia Perzowski worked already in the 2000s with, and Lucia Zamar, one example from our Image Foundation. So in front, this guy you know, this was in the preparation of a project in 2013. So you have a lot of these projects where we worked, and this can be sometimes quite tough, with 12, 15 different curators together. And we try to do that by physical meetings, by exchange, by discussion, a little bit like this Perverse Decolonization project is also now operating. Out of this, you have different projects like this, like subversive practices, culture under the condition of political repression, the 60s till the 80s, South America and Europe. because there were some traces between these two territories we were addressing. With this kind of projects, we try to bring together as much knowledge as possible. And in this project, we are not so much curating, we are much more moderating a process. And also the different sequences in the exhibition are not afterwards homogenized. So they appear in their context of the white cube, but it's very readable when a material is coming from a museum or from two young guys like Emilio Tarazona and come on, where is Miguel Lopez, who started very young to investigate in Peru because they lost the knowledge about the conceptual art under this dictatorship. So they started their own research. What we try to do, what moderating means also in this case very simple, that we try to organize structures of cash flow. So that we try to accumulate money around this kind of project and that we try then to share it between the different interests. And by this we have to be aware that we are a big institution, and when we have an interest to get this knowledge from two persons who more working on a private level, that we don't overdrive them with administrative problems. This was only to get, this is an exhibition of Poetic and Politics of the Voice, in which we worked also with David. This was a different, I show you now some images also of the space. The good thing is that the entire institution is nearly operating like a little theater. We have a big storage, we can recycle, so everything what you see looks quite expensive, but it's built inside. We have a carpenter place, we have media facilities, etc., etc., and a very nice team. I could speak too much about each of these exhibitions, but I guess you get a little bit when we speak about the performative use of exhibition, what it was about. Other exhibitions we are doing are this Stan Douglas, so he was 3 times on Documenta, so we installed with him nearly all his pieces. It was a specific situation to grab the money, installed it perfect, and then there was from the beginning also one condition, that there is no courtesy flick in this exhibition. Flick is this collector who through 3 generations, nowadays he tries only to trick the tax system of Germany. So the son of the son, the grandfather was a guy who makes a lot of money with slavery workers in the Third Reich. So first communication with Stan was then, okay, we don't, and he has Flick has a lot of the stuff from Stan Douglas. First communication was then, okay, we don't accept this collector in our house. I'm not naive. This doesn't mean in the moment when you make a solo exhibition and you produce a catalog that you're not working on the value of the artist and this is the surplus of the collection of Flick. This is not about that. It's much more about to looking for other system next, even when you're working with artists from David Zwirner, that you're looking next to the system, what are different ways of producing an exhibition. She can't be missed. I worked with her in the early 90s. She became a kind of a teacher, Anna Oppermann, hardly known, but also in this case it was very clear that when we will run the Kunstverein that we want to, she died in 93 by cancer, and when we will run an institution which has the capacities to show her body of work, we will do it, and we supported also, we supported also then the team who is working on the heritage of her. So what we done, we closed down the entire exhibition hall for 2 months so that the team could enter, the expert on the body of work could enter, and to install all these elements we have at the scanner there, they could make the first complete registration of this body of work so that it's then becoming part of the knowledge of female artists who were lost in the 80s because they couldn't enter the German market or the museums because the museums were stuffed with Kiefer, basilids, leopards, all this male. Okay, no, I don't comment this. Other productions are coming out of then a very close relationship with an artist, like the Post-Capital project. The Post-Capital project was in 2008. Everybody asking us, "Oh, you make directly was for the financial crisis." Well, this project started in 2004 by a discussion between the essayist, critic, and writer Ivan de la Nurs, who have to leave Cuba because of his political position, and Daniel Garcia Andujar, who was growing under the condition of still educated under Franco. So, and they're discussing what happened in the moment of these transitions of 1989. And Daniel is also an artist who has certain knowledge in hacktivism, so he's not Googling like us. He's starting 5 machines who are running and overcome certain kind of firewalls. Then out of this discussion, they made a lineup of different terms under which they want to research, and then the machine is putting that in the files. So the Post-Capital archive is consisting nowadays of 250,000 files, and each time he's interpreting that for an exhibition. We started with the German flag, with a little hall where it was before the logo of East Germany. And then the process with the artist is that we develop everything very much together and producing it also in this institution. It's a sketch art from Daniel. And then you could enter the different spaces. I go, this was a combination of Ground Zero and then Chile, the 2 9/11s. And at the end or behind this culisse, there was then this tower and an archive. And what was very important so when you're speaking about infrastructure of institution, art institution created a kind of a legal gray zone. At one example, issues of copyright are not very clear in this. So what was there possible? People could come and copy all the files you can't put them online. Then you really have legal issues. There was at one example a library from Agamben to GJ. So everybody could come, put his hard drives there. In Stuttgart, in my hometown Dortmund, it wouldn't have been possible. They would steal the hard drive. But in Stuttgart, it's the second safe city of Germany. So they put their hard drives there and then they copy the entire file. To mediate that, it was an extensive program with workshops, etc., etc. This is part of the different programs. And as I said already, we are cultural based. And then also when the financial crisis appeared in the rich southwest of Germany, there were also cut downs of the cultural budget. And then Daniel helped to set up an Anonymous. He makes the first leaks in the late 90s or something like that. He installed for us Stuttgart so that we got inner information out of the administration. And we said from the beginning, okay, the state opera is not in the cut downs. We don't have a concurrence with the state opera, but we need them as colleagues in solidarity. So then we were gathering, we were meetings, and step by step through this process, there was then a demonstration. It's a 600,000 inhabitant city, Stuttgart, of 3,000 people in front of the mayor house, and they reduced the cut down by from 10 to 5, and then we go deeper in other discussions. At one example around rock music and youth, and there even they have had no cut downs. We didn't separate the cultural field. And this is an incredible base for the institutions. It's very important. And then we made the artist member exhibition, and we installed a kind of an agora. And in this member exhibition, the members can invite people who speak, to have a lecture or something like that. And they invited only people against this big investment in Stuttgart 21, this 10 billion. It's nowadays 10 billion, and it's the same story like the Berlin airport in a way.
May I just add something to what you just said, so for context? So it's actually this huge, you have to imagine it. In the center of Stuttgart, there was a really big park that was right next to the station. Half of that park is now taken up by one of the biggest construction sites in Europe at the moment.
Yeah.
And it's being turned into a combination of a kind of transport hub and a mall. And it was sold to the city as saying, yeah, but on top there will be something like a park. Okay, I just wanted to, because it's really big thing about Stuttgart that everyone in Western Europe knows, basically.
So, at the same time, we were planning with Kai Kosei an exhibition about political design. And in this exhibition, we installed the exhibition The Art of Not Being Governed Like That from Michel Foucault. And this was very much reflecting on this resistance. And this is a short line up, but you can, when you have questions. The protest was very mixed. And sometimes I also would say nowadays you can't be sure if there are were not people in who nowadays voting for the alternative for Germany. So this new right-wing movement. It's have had this camp. In this camp there was one little political thing I found very interesting. The most competent to live outside in a city are homeless people. And the homeless people were in this camp totally integrated in the political struggle by their competences. It started a kind of a sharing which you normally would say is not possible. And we have had the role to give water, electricity and things like that. Then they cleaned up the park very violently for German conditions with 400 eye wounded. One lost his eye, pepper spray, water cannons, kids and old people. There was not a black bloc. There was nothing like that. I was there 12 hours and I know what a black bloc is. We used then the exhibition also as an information tool, how corruption is working in Germany in the real estate business, what are the networks between the politics and the media, etc., etc. And then the resistance start to recognize the space step and step, and they start to use it, and they went then in the corner of South Korea to have their workshop meetings. There were no insurance questions in this exhibition involved. So step by step the building was a kind of a tool for the resistance. And this is nowadays that we have around 100 evenings a year where all these different political social initiatives meetings there. And when they, at one example, also the Antifa, when they need, we don't invite them. They ask us when they need a space in the power display and the center of the city for representation. It's not important that they know that they are in an art institution. Maybe we're doing that now over the last 8 years. And step by step they also joined the exhibition. But this was never the reason. And the Antifa is very clear in the moment in a crisis. With this new growing of the right wing in Germany, they're looking for alliances. And for these alliances with the unions, it's the first time that they're doing that. Parts of them are so radical that they normally not move. So, but now we have now very stable and regular these meetings against far right wings. This was a situation, demonstration, there were some homophobe demonstrations by the right wing, and this means homophobia could be healed. And the situation here with the police was, I was around and I gave all the activists a membership card of the Kunstverein. So they immediately, then the legal status quo changed. So then the police is also in this problem, where to place them. So, okay, I'm just in time. We're going now a little bit into the Bauhaus. When we spoke so much also about this perverse colonization and something for me, the starting point to think about a historical exhibition about the Bauhaus 50 years after 50 years of Bauhaus was not because of 100 years of Bauhaus. In our institution was the opening of a Bauhaus exhibition on the 4th of May 1968. The day before was the occupation of the Sorbonne. So this is a lucky punch. And all the archival material, even the financial report of this time, were laying in our archives. So you were permanently meeting this history. And this exhibition in 1968 was the branding of Bauhaus as a German modernism. And it was a rebuilding of this consciousness of Germany that there was something good. And it appeared between 1918 and if Walter Gropius would have the power, he still would say it disappeared 1928. But also at this, it's like that. At this time, it was already the history was clear, and they also used, of course, the situation of that they were forbidden by the Nazis in 1933. For me, these two images are very striking. This is on the right side. It's directly under the arcades in front of our building. It's Walter Gropius speaking to the students who demonstrating against the shutdown of the High School for Graphic Design in Ulm, HFG, which was the following up of the Bauhaus founded by Ilse Eichner-Scholl and Ott Eichner and Max Bill. And the quite right-wing government, Filbinger, he was a former military justice, was a minister in the Third Reich, was the minister president at that time in Baden-Württemberg. And this is Lübke, the president, who I don't start with the jokes about this stuff. But for me was striking the reappearing of this industrial military complex by having all this Mercedes car as a blockade of the square to save the president when he's coming to the house. So it was this state founded exhibition. And the other aspect which strikes us was that Herbert Bayer was the scenographer of this exhibition. So Walter Gropius was still involved in the concept, and Herbert Bayer was one of the scenographers. So you have certain kind of dispositives which are organized around them. And of course, we start to read the Bauhaus from 2018. So we also could look back on the entire critique which started from the latest from the 50s on and was full established already. This critique of the modern city, etc., etc. So we were also looking a lot of material I won't show now, which was basically along the discussion of Askar Jorn with Max Bill. Out of this, you have this Bauhaus Imaginiste. The Bauhaus Imaginiste was connected with the lettrist connected with the Situationist, and of course with this to 1968. This is the maquette of the old exhibition as a reinterpretation by Mona Mahal and Asil Zerbes. So it was very much an exhibition about exhibitions. This gives you a general view in the exhibition hall. And I will only highlight one aspect. We also were looking from all the different documents, scenographies from certain exhibition from the 1925 till at least 43, because Herbert Bayer had had an impact influence on the graphic design and the appearance of different exhibitions. He was working for the unions. He was then later working for the Museum of Modern Art when he left 1938 to the US. This is a look back. But what is still not in the text of the Bauhaus and still not in the text of this construction of this concept or idea of modernism is the impact of modernism in fascism. So Herbert Bayer was he was the graphic designer of the three main fascist exhibitions, which they were directly commissioned by the propaganda ministry of Goebbels. And there are all these rumors that he came very poor to US. He made incredible good money with the Nazis. And Lili Reich, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, they were all, it's not about moral, it's about why the Nazis have had the need to adapt a modernist language in their propaganda structure. And you can look, you have all this very annoying material, but then you have here as a representation of in this exhibition German folk, German work of, this is from Lili Reich and Mies van der Rohe, or this super modernist setups from Walter Gropius. Then what became an icon of graphic design, as this, from this exhibition, The Miracle of Life. And this is, it seems to be that no one ever reads the texts. But they became an incredible, important example of valuable, world-leading design language. And it's becoming more and more worse than in 1936. So what we try to do is then to go along this figure and follow certain kind of ideological aspect. Because also there was an immediately transfer in graphic design language when he then came to the US. He made the first exhibition of the Bauhaus in the Museum of Modern Art, but then he made with the entry of the US in the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, which was already before organized. The entire industry was already working on it. He immediately curated and made the scenography of two exhibitions, Road to Victory and Airways to Peace, which again takes the same language he used for the scenography of the fascists. There's no black appearing in these images. And of course it was to enforce the people or to give them the empowerment to go against the fascist system. I stop here, it's now 28 minutes and 30 seconds. I think maybe by questions something coming up. So this is a short, very, very quick drive to the last 13 years.
Thank you, Hans. If you have any questions, please.
Can I ask Hans a question? So, Hans.
For the mic.
Oh, okay. How do you see the role of non-European artists in your practice, and how is it generally in Germany? Like, is there, I mean, what I was saying before of the need to decolonize art institutions, do you see that similarly, or is it really not as big a need? And how does that work when that's declared in this agenda, or should it be just part of a regular, any agenda? Maybe you could talk a little bit about that trope that's been around over the last years. I mean, people, you know, all over, like almost every institution in Germany now somehow mentions wanting to do that at some point, but I wonder how you see it.
Well, sometimes this feels like Germany is still cooking in this pot of this 80 million population self-referential system. I think there are two elements which we have to separate when we're speaking about institutions. I don't say that because I want to protect the practice, but first of all, on the level of the museum landscape, we also have to see they collected over the last century mainly material out of the sphere where they can recognize themselves in like a mirror relationship. So this was even that we were looking the state galleries on the right side and the more regional oriented collection museums on the other side. So we don't have to repeat that at that point. But it's a binding aspect. You have this heritage and somehow you deal still with this heritage. But for me it was kind of a shocking information. There was an extra program by the Cultural Foundation of Germany where museums could apply to rethink and reorganize along this question their collection and what is missing in the program. On the entire amount of money which was there, and it was only for museums, if not because it was about a collection, we don't have collection, only 2 museums applied. There was not an interest. So this is an indication for that they are still rotating very much around this kind of cultural practice. When I'm looking in the field of the Kunstvereine, I think it's slightly changing. But I think that with the Württembergische Kunstverein, maybe we were coming very much from a periphery, from a grassroots development, where we didn't came with any clear value agenda of what is important, what not, what can I mediate, what not. So that we were thinking we have to build up this communication every time new. This was in the beginning when we came to Stuttgart really a problem. We also have a transformation of the public. It's there's still a very clear and very strong moment where the scene is, and also the public is binded with this kind of value perspectives. And when you show them, you have a mediation problem. And when you have a mediation problem, you have to develop specific programs. And this also creates misunderstanding. And one example, a lot of these meetings of these big curatorial groups, we said, okay, we are all sitting together, we have to introduce each other, why we don't make that public? And then the people came and were thinking, now they get a professional lecture series. So the formats are not there. So.
Can I ask a question about this image?
Yeah.
What is it exactly? I mean, it's in the point chair, but it's superimposed with something else.
Irony. It's connected with this. Walter Benjamin, Experience and Poverty. So I stopped there as a lecture. You shouldn't have so much thesis. And it's the image is a combination of this, of course, this famous Breuer chair and Mass by Schlemmer. Some people say it's, the woman is Lucia Molinoch. And the background image is someone who is not directly Bauhaus, but was taught collages in the Bauhaus, Friedrich Böhrer. And it was a book in 1933 which describes the need for Germany to extend their military power.
I want to ask a little bit about this kind of hospitality towards activist groups and like institution functions in the city, certain political groups. So yeah, I'm very curious about that. I mean, do you have any? Is that like easy? Is that a kind of ongoing battle? I mean, do you have to use sort of your autonomy, the artistic autonomy, in order for that to be possible, you know, there's a field of authorities. Why doesn't it become your main goal, you know, or like happy daily, or, you know, maybe it's also about the use value, you know, of such a place, of such a machine, in political terms. So it's like a one-off, you know, or is it something that's like...
No, it's very regular. I was speaking about, well, from this is what I showed, this is the entrance part, and there all the furnitures are on wheels. So it's in 15 minutes empty, and then you can make gatherings there with maybe with a bar or something like that, with 200 sometimes. I don't care so much about fire regulations, but sometimes there are much more people there, and they contact us. We have an Excel file, and then it's a little bit like the blackboard, and then we also researching, of course, because there are people we don't want to have in. The anti-right-wing meetings, as one example, we have, then they organize everything, so they also activate their network. Sometimes the program is in partnership, or sometimes we only give the space. And what I didn't show, sometimes we rent the space also for money, and this have to finance then. That's at one example, in a house like this, you have people for the alarm, the security, you have to have someone there, you have to pay, I pay them. So I have to need an income also from the space, because these groups pay nothing. So this is very informal. It's sometimes also that 2 weeks before something happened, we don't know. So they can. So this is quite nice. We are not a big team. We are in total, and most of them not 100%. We have 16 employees. But I think the team is also going with this kind of, again, I know nobody in the team who is not against Stuttgart 21, because it was also a discussion. It was also the discussion with the team, because the first, when someone is coming who is for Stuttgart 21, when someone coming with against, that we took before the last election clear position against the AfD, Alternative for Germany, they behind the counter are the first who are addressed, and you can't do this political program without discussing with the people there if they are willingly to accept that some aggressive idiots are coming, or they know that they mostly, when we are there, they immediately can send them to us, to hear something.
So you spoke as an institution against the AfD?
Yeah. And we are an association. This is very important. We are not a city or a state institution. So there is no way that this is.
You can afford it.
Yeah. We are paid by them, of course. And when we made that, we got a letter from how to pronounce Anwalt?
A lawyer.
A lawyer. I say every time lawyer. A lawyer. Okay. Then we from a lawyer, from
an attorney,
from the who came from this right wing, sent us a letter and requested our if that allows that we take. This is what's going on in the moment in Germany. This is not very much seen. This was also the development in France when imagine you running an art institute nowadays in Germany in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where they have over 20%. They request in the Academy of Leipzig, they request why and with what reason you have programs for foreign students. So this entire program is already what they was very interesting. There was on the Antifa meeting was one from the union, and he described how regular they are now going into the factories. So this is so it's operating, and when you're looking in the moment in Europe, sometimes we work incredible a lot with Hungary. In Hungary, we lost all our partners. They changed all the directors, and they're changing even the directors of the schools. They're going really deep into the system. This is already not something where you could say you have one election and then it's done.
In Poland, it's also
this is starting there now. So this is you immediately can recognize also. For this, we need this reanalysis of the structures of how fascism entered the administrations and how they didn't went out of the German administration after 1945.
And in other European countries too.
As Adenauer said, if you only have brown water to drink, you drink it, which is a lie. So this is. I think we have to rethink the positions of the institutions in Germany. We still in this super smooth, liberal, blah blah blah. But I guess we have to act in a much more direct political sense. So. And this not automatically have to overdrive the entire artistic practices.
Exactly.
This is not. We have the nice opportunity to have certain moments where it meets and certain moments where it goes in different direction. And we have the surplus is where we are in the topography of the city.
So you have a very interesting account of the way in which post-colonial tropes have been reused and misused in right-wing agenda nowadays.
Can you talk a bit
now? Now, the question is, what is to blame? The theory of reality. That is, do you see that, because it seemed to me that at one point you gave an explanation which is about the problems in the theory of post-colonialism, was a neo-Marxist critique of post-colonialism. But in a way, things have so dramatically changed that today the tropes of post-colonialism are being adjusted to a different reality in which post-colonialism is completely detached from any sort of decolonial struggle or imaginary. So, what kind of critique is that?
At our event in Cologne in autumn, we had Vivek Chibber, who's one of these people who's criticizing post-colonial studies. Probably, so there are a few. Walter Ben Michaels, the guy who's Assad Haida, Walter Ben Michaels, Vivek Chibber. It's a growing group of people who are really making a founded critique of post-colonial studies and identity politics and how they interrelate with one another. The politics of that, of course, have to do with the US election, have to do with the critique of Hillary Clinton and her not focusing enough on a blue-collar workers and investing. This is a critique that's also maybe not actually so accurate of her politics and of why she lost. So that the stimulus somehow for this rethinking was problematical. But they do actually, and Vivek Chibber, when he was in Cologne, gave a very convincing account of how that works around Edward Said's book Orientalism, which he didn't, whose value as a book and as a landmark of post-colonial theory, he didn't call into question, but he showed very convincingly how some argumentative strands, for an example, Said's vehement anti-Marxism, so that Marx is identified as basically as an imperialist and a theorist of Orientalism. So you know, the things like this actually are recoding the post-colonial agenda, or the agenda of post-colonial studies, I should say, that was indeed linked to, you know, struggles to also economic struggles, and that is brushed aside and sort of thrown out as a primitive Marxist explanation that culture is the sphere where you should really look for complexity. And this is I think if you look at a theoretical problem, I think this kind of culturalization would be the place to look, to say that you know that you replace the understanding of a social totality that includes, you know, economics, power structures, law, religion, and you subsume all of that under a cultural practice, and then you say, well, in the cultural paradigm of insert in the blank, it's like this and this. Instead of trying to use historical explanations, you essentialize and you and you open the door to the so-called strategic essentialism, where you say, well, no, this is our culture, rather than this is our position, this is our struggle, this is the inequality that's involved. It's you reduce it to a cultural problematic. So that would be one.
This we knew before Trump, right? We knew that. I mean, this was the critique of post-colonialism even in the 90s.
I think the Trump election has made that much more vocal and has given that a kind of political, you know, tip, so to speak, that makes it more effective. Yes, of course, Vivek Chibber didn't write his book after the election, but I think it becomes, let's say, more plausible. I think also this kind of, you know, more neo-Marxist, you know, a position that's claiming, let's say, not the democratic socialism of Sanders, but something more radical, has gotten a new lease on life through in the current configuration. I think you're right, though. I think that reality has changed, and that the role that culture and insisting upon, you know, a kind of culturalization itself has become a kind of has been drawn into a post-Fordist neoliberal economy. You know, culture is used constantly in gentrification processes. Culture is constantly used to cover things up in a profoundly different way than it was before, I think. And I think it's much more widespread, and it goes together. I really think so. So yeah, there's definitely a shift in the kind of mode of production of knowledge that we saw over the last 25 years that's profound, and that changes the status of any resistant discourse, actually. So as a communist, you could get up in a bourgeois institution and say all kinds of stuff, and actually you're partaking in that same kind of culturalized version of communism, and you possibly, you know, are doing very little, actually, in terms of political efficiency. Maybe you're changing something in a cultural paradigm or something like this, and this could be super important, but, you know, maybe also not. So that's what I meant.
Two things. Just to say about Vivek Chibber, that he was also using actually Arab intellectuals who were criticizing Said in real time from a Marxist perspective, and were really, how do you say it, actually in Khamsin, in the publication by Matzpen back in the day. But just kind of, totally dismissed, but they were under Assad, and they didn't have positions in US academia, so they didn't have anything to say that was viable, I don't know, like worthy of participating in the discussion for the people who were, you know, into Orientalism as a field. What is it called? Or in arms, kind of. I wanted to ask, because there's this famous quote, you know, show me fascism, and I'll show you a revolution that failed, right? I think it's like every kind of floating quote, maybe this is also Walter Benjamin, but you know, like, you know, this kind of idea. Yeah. So I'm wondering what's the revolution that failed, because specifically in relation to Trump, it seems that it also has to do with the digital revolution. So being that there is a kind of an alliance between these how should I say, Nazi online oligarchy of the West Coast. These cyber libertarians on the one hand, and on the other, very different groups that you know don't have this access to the resources that these people from California have. So I'm wondering, for both of you, what do you see? I mean, if we take this scenario, what would be the revolution that failed? And maybe it is, you know, post-colonial studies that you know, like celebrating diversity in the 1990s when there was huge privatization, and so there was a lot of surplus to enjoy, and then when we get to our time, when it's recession and zero growth, then it becomes a war of identities, like a very different. So it's a question. So how would you see that?
Go ahead. Yeah. Maybe revolutions need 800 years. This is speculation by Josef Vogel. This is because you're asking now a question about a deep structure of a historical relationship where I really don't know at which point we should start. We could take the critique of Lefebvre on Foucault or something like that. When you're speaking about the left program, about this perspective to be at a certain point sometimes political, very sharp and clear how the production of space is organized. You can also, and this was now with Benedict Anderson, you could even start with the question that there is a bourgeois construction of the national state, and that there is a binding of the nationals from the people living in the state with this nationalist construction every time since the beginning of the national state by populism. So this is, I don't know where it's failed, and what then you could. This would be another point when you. This is the narrative which came after this image, and where I would like to work also on in the perverse colonization is the development of what's happened with this two big industrialized wars, which creating the entire relationship between the concept of the industrial military complex, which is even driving only to speak about the US, the entire settlement, the entire Fordistic production, etc., etc., which interests me then along this forms when this helplessness of modernism, how to react on this potential, at least. Ludwig Hilbersheimer was not someone who wanted to destroy space and people and social control. He was totally despaired by the fact that there's now the potential to erase the humanity or something like that. All this images are moving. And the digital can't be. The digital is only another narrative in this form of the production. It's quite specific, but I would be careful about this critique of the totalitarianism of the algorithm. This is again too simple, because then immediately you lose the potential of a counter-narrative.
I don't know, my answer would be kind of horribly simple, which is to say that, you know, almost everything terrible in the world is somehow emancipation gone wrong, you know, and like, yes, also fascism, look for fascism, you find a failed revolution, look at any religion, and you find, you know, aspirations of human emancipation as well, actually. So is a religion fascist? No. Every religion fascist? No. But so I don't know if the logic really works, or if it's that good of a descriptive tool. I think what you're getting at is a legitimate point, though, that this kind of emancipative la globalization and its personalization and distribution as a consumer commodity to everyone, so that everyone has a device and like we're all connected and we all get to say our voice and we all get to invent our little Photoshop cartoons and sort of make them viral, and these ideas that have a kind of empowering side to them. Yes, they went completely wrong. Yes, the internet is a complete enclosure at this point and has undergone this kind of enclosure process. And now you have yes, you have many disaffected subjects who are still sort of looking to keep that affect alive, possibly, yeah, in that repressive structure, and it's something that's basically become a surveillance tool. I mean, it sounds to me though technologically deterministic, and I would be careful with that, because at the same time, you could say, yeah, but it's also like it's actually the whole project of national self-determination as a part of a leftist discourse on, has developed so many problems, and those are those failed revolutions right there. And the failure is just something that takes an extremely long time. As Hans was saying, a revolution takes 800 years, and this is well, you were quoting that. So if you take this longer scale to look at like the immediate event, Arab Spring, digital revolution, you could add, different historical events to that. I'm not sure. I think the main failure, for me, it's still the horizon, of socialism in the 20th century and how that fell on its face, but and sort of embarrassed itself, but is still somehow lying there, and not actually, as it's said, usually it disappeared. This is the prospect of a socialist revolution at some point is not necessarily something that has been completely forgotten, and its effects actually in the steps that were taken in that direction are real. They're not illusory, as you were saying before. So I think we should maybe look there rather than in the digital, but it's maybe just fun. Yeah?
Maybe I'm connecting to it, maybe not. I'm going back to what you said about the Philippine guy, the writer that told you that post-colonialism, what are you talking about? We are not dealing with it for the last 20 years or so. And I was thinking that it's if in a post-colonial areas they are not dealing with it, they move to a different place. But at the same time, we're in the middle of this huge wave of immigrants, of refugees coming from all those colonial places into the West. But we are talking about decolonization, and we are talking about post-colonial studies, and this is what we are dealing with. And on the same time, maybe I'm jumping and I'll try to connect it, I'm thinking about, and we talked about it before, this moment of 67, 68, and this solidarity, this obscene word of solidarity, of resistance, of resistant groups in different areas of the world, in post-colonial places and also in different half, simple, and the solidarity of the West, and of course the collapse of all these movements, and our crisis of the left, of the resistance, of what we are doing with this world. And then I'm thinking about what we were experiencing this afternoon, and what you said, Eyal, that it's like we are feeling there, that we talked about the right wing in Israel and about Temple Mount, and that we are in this feeling that they are winning all the time and they are always talking about how they are losing, but they change strategy and they are looking on the situation in a different way. And I feel that many times we are stuck in the same categories, that we are trying to organize differently, but we are stuck in them. And maybe this is what you started to say, maybe not, that we are like we are in a different age and we are a different time, and we still don't understand what's going on here. And now when we are talking about decolonization, and maybe it's not relevant anymore. Like maybe we need to find the different, I don't know, or the different categories, because of course I agree with you, of course, how you map the situation, and that this is the biggest challenge. But then how we are going over it, doing it, like taking the.
But you know what's strange in all of this? It is still so super relevant because, and in Germany especially, and I guess that's the stimulus, you know, at least to deal with it is, okay, so it's quite, in that way, quite mechanistic. Yes, you have a big influx of non-Germans into a previously completely homogenous country, and now suddenly this becomes an issue. It becomes important that culture represent that change. That's like a basic thing. But then when you get, I think when you get further into it, there's the question, what does this post-colonial studies do and where does it look? So does it look at an inner colonialism and how colonialism has been internalized by capitalism fundamentally and is part of the proposition from the beginning to the end, so to speak? Or does it isolate the situation of the post-colony, look only there from the position of a privileged Western gaze? I think that's really the big question, because, you know, like the latter is just classical anthropology retooled for a contemporary situation. The former, maybe, could be a perspective. If we start to understand the position of a migrant, you know, not a migrant worker, it's not the right term, a refugee who has attained an asylum status and then works in the service industry and is trapped there, for an example. And there are quite a few such people in Germany. Actually, I would say that the service sector has basically been, you know, it's really like, in other European countries, that's actually not the case. So, to the same degree. I mean, even in Norway, you could find Norwegians who are working in the McDonald's. I'm not sure you could find in Germany. So this is really a thing to talk about the ideological structures of domination, to talk about how education, how the very idea of integration is structured as in a colonial way. And to talk about our Western, supposedly non-colonial, or, you know, completely like it's the metropolis. What are you talking about? There's no colony here. The colonies are elsewhere, and the post-colonial, the colonial injustices are elsewhere. They're not here. Here we have some other situation. Here we have xenophobia, racism, but it's not colonialism structurally, economically. And the point is that it is. And that, I think, that inner colonialism is something that post-colonial studies could address, but doesn't, because it plays the game of victimhood and identity politics ascribed to elsewhere, and to the right to sort of, you know, frame yourself as like, yeah, I'm here, but I'm also elsewhere. This is very important, right, of course, yeah, you should defend it. But, you know, maybe that also then becomes, you know, a hindrance to re-territorializing post-colonial studies in the metropolis properly, where it could be a critical tool rather than a representative one. That would be my answer. But the second part of the question I just now avoided and veered away from, and I have to think about some more tomorrow, maybe.
Yeah, okay.
So very briefly, please.
I guess it seems as if the idea of you kind of smash post-colonialism with decolonialism, which is a problem. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about decolonialism, which I see as the ways in which Western hegemonic categories have been implemented on colonialized population, and they're going through a process within which they take those categories away. And we're seeing some of the strongest movements in the United States are actually using this legacy of decolonialism, such as Black Lives Matter, the Latino movement, the sort of coalition between BDS and Palestinians with black activists. So decolonialism is actually a very, very strong movement, the only counter movement I would say right now in the United States. And the reason that Bernie, in some ways, was not able to get full momentum is because he kept on clashing with Black Lives Matters. So this is a decolonial movement. So I think that a separation needs to be made between the sort of Hillary neoliberal diversity that the sort of white working class were very much against, and the sort of more thoughtful identity politics, which is around like texts like the Cambia River Collective. So you want to look at the interlocking forms of oppression and create coalitions around them. So I guess my question would be, if you accept these premises, and do you see the sort of issues with decolonialization and the sort of movements over in the United States are all working in reality like Europe or Russia?
No, of course, I conflated the two. I apologize for that, and there should be a distinction made because it's important for those theorists who claimed, and those movements that are claiming to be not, post-colonial studying from an academic, but actually decolonizing as an agenda and as a practice. I think that, though, having said that, my critique of, strategic essentialism or of claiming, let's say, a kind of exclusivity from a minor, like to be brief, I mean, a minor nationalism doesn't make it better that it's minor. I really don't think so, because once it becomes, maybe Israel actually is a good illustration for this, yeah, that you have a long history of Zionism as a resistance to a domination in Europe of Jews, yeah. This at least is how it was understood by many Jews in Europe in the 19th and early 20th century. And that completely flips into its own opposite, and nobody is free from it, and it's horrible if you could imagine the kind of, out of an identitarian, back to the roots rhetorics. I'm not saying that all decolonizing movements have to go that direction. But I think that this is a tendency. There's a tendency, for an example, it's clear, no, that there's a difference between a kind of new exclusionism that comes and a genuine desire to try to forge coalitions and to find one's way into a really, these intersectional struggles. I think there is a big difference, and it comes to the fore, I think, in these discussions of cultural appropriation, for an example, that are extremely essentialist. Like this discussion of the Dana Schutz painting in the Whitney Biennial, where suddenly, like, only one person has the right to the victimhood and to talk about victimhood. And if anyone else does it, it's an appropriation, like white people playing blues or something. Like, how dare you? You're appropriating another person's victimhood and talking about that. You can't do that. So that's a very essentialist way of thinking about solidarity or how to enact it. Like, you should only stay within your own culture that you have defended and so on. I think that's the issue that I was trying to get at, rather than the terminology. I mean, there's a big difference clearly also between the position of engagement and the intensity of engagement, certainly.
Okay, thank you everybody. We really need to finish now.